the floor for a lessons and reflections discussion panel with powerful organizers who help shape integral programs that lead to significant wins. My name is Lashmi Gopal, and I'm an organizer with Roots Action, also a former member of the Bernie 2020 National Organizing Team, spearheading the door-to-door canvassing program, which was created to offset the staff in Super Tuesday states that we could simply not afford with our budget. We filled in with canvassing needs throughout the country where staff couldn't be on the ground. The Bernie 2020 campaign was a true example of a people-powered campaign, and we're excited to have our guest tonight to share a glimpse of the various programs behind the scenes that further revolutionize the way we organize on electoral campaigns. Before we dive in, let's quickly go over what Once Again PACT is and our mission between now and the Democratic National Convention in August. Once Again is a political action committee organizing votes for Bernie in upcoming primary elections up until the Democratic National Convention in August. Every 4 years, the Democratic Party decides their party platform, and although Bernie has suspended his campaign, we have a chance to bring these platforms to the convention in August to be voted on. By reaching that 1,200 total delegate threshold for Bernie Sanders, platforms like Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, student debt cancellation, and an end to for-profit war have the potential of making it onto the party platform for the next 4 years. In addition, our work for the campaign has not stopped. Once Again PAC, along with other partner organizations like Roots Action, Progressive Democrats of America, the People for Bernie, and hundreds of volunteers have been working to remind folks to still vote for Bernie because we understand just how important it is to continue fighting for these issues. As we're seeing the New York and Kentucky election results come in, we are witnessing over 143,335 voters continue to mark Bernie on the ballot at the polls. And we're awaiting the mail-in ballot count. If we intend to beat Trump in November, whoever the Democratic nominee is will need to push bold platform that will truly benefit working class people. Platforms like Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, the end to student debt cancellation, and an end to for-profit war. So tell your Bernie friends and supporters, if they live in Delaware, New Jersey, Louisiana, or Connecticut, we don't know how New York or Connecticut or Kentucky will turn out for the next couple of days, but we will continue spearheading the word about Bernie still being on the ballot in those states that I just mentioned. We've got absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain at this point by continuing to vote for Bernie Sanders through the primary election. Biden may become the presumptive Democratic nominee. And if he is, he'll need to concede to any one of these platforms in order to truly unite the divide in the party and defeat Donald Trump in November. And we're here to put the pressure on. We want to make it clear that our intentions are not at all to make Bernie the Democratic nominee. It's just no longer possible, and we want to be real with you about that. But we do want to continue in this fight for working class people by garnering votes for Bernie to help him get the 1,200 total delegates. And as mentioned, the Democratic Party decides their platform every 4 years at the convention. So if we can get them to endorse one of these progressive platforms as their own, we'll be one step closer to the changes we want to see. So if you believe in a Green New Deal, Medicare for All, student debt cancellation, and an end to for-profit warmongering, be sure to vote for Bernie and organize your networks and remind them to vote by mail for Bernie in the 4 remaining primary states. That's Delaware, New Jersey, Louisiana, and Connecticut. So now let's dive into this panel discussion with our distinguished organizers. Lynn, go ahead and kick us off.
Woo! Thank you for the intro, Lachmi, and hello, everyone. My name is Lynn Hua, and I'm an organizer with Roots Action and the former out-of-state program director on the Bernie 2020 campaign. Some of you may recognize the out-of-state program as Bernie Journey. We've got some really special guests on this call who have worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteer leaders to make groundbreaking strides in grassroots organizing on the scale of a presidential campaign, work that can absolutely be adopted and individualized by other progressive campaigns or down ballot candidates who are advocates for Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, and all of Bernie's other platforms. Now, without further ado, let's introduce our amazing guest speakers and my fellow comrades. First, we have Jess Newman, who is currently serving as the Civic Engagement Manager for United for Respect. Most recently, Jess was the National Relational Organizer for the Bernie 2020 campaign, helping to build the largest relational organizing program in U.S. electoral history through friend-to-friend organizing. Previously, Jess worked in the labor movement in communication, legislative, and community organizing staff, and led the statewide electoral program for one of the largest independent expenditure campaigns in the history of Michigan elections. In addition, she is the campaigns coordinator for Detroit DSA and a member of the National Growth and Development Committee in DSA. Next, we have Michelle Lim, who was the National Help Desk Organizer, specialized in voter protection for all 50 states. On the campaign, she compiled comprehensive state voter guides to ensure that Bernie supporters were aware of state voting rules in their state. On the Help Desk team, her team of volunteers processed the campaign's primary inbox, social media messages, and voter information hotline. She also managed the live chat desk team that answered inquiries from the campaign website. She then later joined the national texting team towards the later half of the campaign. Prior to Bernie 2020, Michelle was the voting rights policy advocate at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, where she advocated for more fair voting policies for immigrant voters and voters of color. She worked on language access and voter protection issues to ensure that politically marginalized communities have access to the ballot. She managed their election day poll monitoring program, training and deploying volunteers across the state to prevent disenfranchisement and protect the vote. Then there's Vanessa Grisko, who was the former National Spanish Text Team organizer for the Bernie 2020 campaign. In addition to translating text messaging scripts in Spanish, she also worked on translating phone banking scripts and pages on the official website that, without a doubt, was in direct correlation to Bernie's high support among the Latinx community and the massive turnout for first-time Spanish-speaking voters. She was also a former sustainability consultant in Chicago for 5 years. She volunteered on the Lori Lightfoot mayoral campaign and Andrew Gillum race in Southwest Florida. She is now involved in consulting text team programs for the Movement for Black Lives and a handful of smaller campaigns around the country with a focus on Spanish outreach. Last but not least, we have Harinee Suthakar, who was the national distributed events organizer on the Bernie 2020 campaign. She managed volunteer teams that enabled over 58,000 volunteer-led events and supported the Bernie Victory Captains program. She supported hundreds of volunteers all across the country and created the infrastructure for a virtual events program when the COVID-19 lockdown hit. She most recently dedicated her time to the Jamal Bowman campaign and the Movement for Black Lives, and is currently volunteering with the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, a project of UE and DSA to support workers who want to organize their workplace. She's a Pittsburgh native, enjoys playing tennis, and is looking forward to reuniting with friends when possible. She is currently also based in Philly. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have dear friends of the movement join us tonight for this discussion panel. We'll read off some questions and anyone can hop in to answer at any given time. Remember to unmute yourself as you're speaking and mute yourself when you're done speaking. We'd like to hear from everyone throughout the course of this panel, so just unmute and hop in where you deem fit. And please feel free to bounce off each other and feed off of each other's energy. All right. So first question, explain the impact of your individual program. What were some highlights or significant moments experienced on the campaign?
I can go first. I'll kick it off. This is a really big question. So I led our friend-to-friend organizing team, and we did something that no other campaign has been able to do, which is to scale what we call relational organizing, which is literally just organizing your friends and talking to the people in your network. So there's not really great ways to track those conversations. There's not really good information about how to have them. that's been done over several years. So we really were able to experiment through this work with our high-level organizers. And I think what we found is that when we gave these volunteers extraordinarily high levels of work and expectations, they met them. We made over 100,000 calls, I want to say, over the course of a month, which was just insane. And we did it with a team of about 350 people who just dedicated all of their time to following up with folks across the country to get them to do this work of following up with their friends and family. So really, we ended up making a massive dent on the margins where it really matters, getting people to actually turn out. We found that folks who were contacted using our app were twice as likely to show up and actually vote. So, and that was due to the volunteer labor of this dedicated core of people, just calling and having conversations with fellow Bernie supporters about the importance of the work. So we learned quite a bit that I will be bringing with me into this current work that I'm hopeful to share with as many progressive campaigns as possible, because truly we found that relational really is one of the most effective forms of voter turnout. So I'm going to kick it off because there were so many incredible campaign components on this in this team.
I can pick up there.
Oh, yeah, please.
Great. So I'm Harinee. I was on the events team and was one of about 6 people total who ran the events program, which was, like Jess said, also run by incredible volunteers. And so this involved the events team in particular helped volunteers organize in their local communities. So our goal was to get as many people talking to fellow voters about Bernie and our platform as possible. In the course of the campaign, we supported over 58,000 volunteer-led events and made over 46,000 personal phone calls to support event hosts. So one of the teams that I had the pleasure of running was called the Event Support Team, that made personal one-to-one phone calls to prepare organizers and volunteers to host phone banks and house parties and canvases, among other event types in their neighborhoods or in their local areas. And so this team in particular involved, host support, which was incredibly high touch for the large presidential campaign that we were running. I think that was one thing that differentiated us, the one-to-one connections that we were facilitating among supporters themselves, and that sense of community. This also involved host training, so training folks on how to host a phone bank, how to have organizing conversations like Jess was talking about earlier. And then another component of this program, which I got to support, was called the Bernie Victory Captains Program that Sophie Lassoff led, and Claire Wyatt, Bhavik, and Tomas, among others, Ruth. So that program was about volunteer leadership development. So the events team had host support, host trainings, and then also the Bernie Victory Captains Program, which encouraged folks who are already kind of leading and organizing in their communities to lean into their leadership and host weekly events to talk to an unprecedented number of voters. I guess the other thing that I'll leave us with is I think other campaigns should distributed organizing can be used to scale events and programs and organizing efforts. So we had volunteers who weren't in states that were priority states at first because they would vote later on, support us in this way by vetting events and reviewing events. We had an event moderation team, and then we had an event support team where folks would make phone calls.
Awesome. I'll jump in. I was part of the national texting team, specifically on the Spanish text team. Our campaign ran the largest text team in the history of modern politics. We sent over 260 million text messages utilizing Spoke. This was primarily all because of the 30,000 volunteers texting specific that were there every day. We had 200 to 300 super volunteers is what we called, and we really built this tiered level. So we had a lot of volunteers that kind of served as these staff hybrids in which they were able to help us host webinar trainings on the weekdays, help us create some of those resources, help us with the feedback, help moderate the channels, and be able to vet all of the different volunteers that you had coming into your pipeline. This, I think, is definitely able to do on a smaller scale. I think as long as you start to build a very clear pipeline for the volunteers that come in, allowing them to be able to allocate how much time they have to give to your campaign, and also asking some questions like, do they already speak a different language, or are they experts in something like data, or are they experts in, would they rather do something like phone banking? Having these different levels of organizations that they can be involved in helps a volunteer be able to decide how can they get involved given the amount of time that they may have to give. The text team especially was able to kind of cast a wide net. We would text large swaths around the country and be able to allocate who are our core supporters and turn those supporters into volunteers. Further, who are the what area do we find people just need a little bit of persuasion, and being able to go back to those people and contact them once it came time to them voting. And further, we were able to recruit for events all over the country. We were able to send out critical voting information day of for Get Out the Vote efforts, and specifically have the Spanish component, which I think was really important for inviting people that maybe have not had a chance or a seat at the table before to volunteer in their native language.
Awesome. I'll share a little bit about Bernie 2020's Help Desk, the National Help Desk. So I was working with, I was one of 3 help deskers on staff where we worked with our volunteer team who basically managed the campaign's primary inbox. So whether it was info@berniesanders.com or the Facebook messages we were getting from Bernie's Facebook page, or the Twitter DMs we were getting, the private messages we were receiving on his Twitter account, we were managing his primary inbox. And then on top of that, we launched a live chat volunteer team where if anybody visited berniesanders.com, they were able to reach a volunteer on the other end using the chat widget. So they could ask any question about how to get involved, or just questions about the campaign at all. They would be talking to a real human being on the other side of that chat. And then, of course, the best thing ever was towards when all the primaries were happening and the caucuses, we launched our phone desk team, which was a voter information hotline. We had 17 different hotlines, one number for every state, where people can just call in to the campaign, talk to, again, a real human being about how to vote for Bernie and get all of the information that they need in order to vote. So whether it's questions like, do I have to be a registered Democrat in order to vote for Bernie in this upcoming primary? Or how do I vote by mail? Or is there a way I could vote in person early? All sorts of questions that people will be asking in order to cast their ballot for Bernie. Our volunteer was on the other line, talking with them, listening to their story, and then making a plan with them in order to get them out to vote for Bernie. And so our team was relatively smaller than the other distributed teams here today. We had about 130 volunteers processing all of these different modes of communication. And we were answering all sorts of questions, really. It could be about, people writing in about Medicare for All and literally writing their life story and saying, hey, do I qualify for Medicare for All, right? They would be asking, what's the difference between Bernie's platforms and this other progressive candidate's platforms. People will be asking about how do I host an event, like for Harinee's team. And then they would ask us about, very specific ways that they could get involved. People would write us in and saying, is Bernie ever going to be in Delaware? Because I would really want him to come by to my ice cream shop, or, all sorts of things, right? But I would say that the work that our help desk team did was, number one, make sure that our supporters, but even if they weren't a supporter of Bernie, right, were being truly heard by our campaign. And, as the slogan was, not me, us, right, we wanted our campaign to be very approachable and very responsive, so that if, a lot of people would write into us not expecting to get a reply back, but our volunteers would be there, writing very thoughtful, personalized messages to answer their inquiries. And so that was our goal, right? To make sure that our campaign was approachable and personable. But also the other thing was to make sure that if someone wanted to vote for Bernie, that they were able to. And that's when the voter protection piece of Help Desk comes into play, where we, compiled all the info state by state to make sure that, all the rules and all the policies are different state by state. And so our volunteers knew what those were and were able to provide that information for when people called us in and asking us how they can caucus or vote for Bernie. So I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about the critical role that our volunteers played, but Help Desk would not have been possible without, our team of hundreds of volunteers putting in 10 to 20 hours a week to make sure that people were heard.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing these individual pieces of your program. If anything, the Bernie campaign had one of the most comprehensive mass-scale organizing programs ever seen in presidential campaign history. And even so, we recognize that party politics will always be a point of contention for bold, progressive, anti-establishment candidates like Bernie, who want to transform the party itself. And although the campaign suspended, our tremendous efforts in grassroots organizing was made possible through the thousands of volunteers or hundreds of volunteers that joined these specialized teams to help make this entire effort and all the moving pieces possible. So the next question that I wanted to dive into is, how do distributed volunteers make it possible for small dollar campaigns to have a fighting chance? And how can this be adopted by future progressive campaigns who need the help of volunteers to fill in where their staffing budget can't?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. I think a lot of this comes down, especially if you're on a tight budget, is utilizing some of the resources that are already out there that are free. So, something like Slack serves as a wonderful volunteer hub to have everyone in one place. You've got your call team in one channel, you've got your text team in one channel, and you've got, a section for announcements, and you can constantly be able to just get all of the information out at once. And I thought that was a really great tool, especially because it's free. Other free tools out there, Google Forms, just to be able to recruit and scope out who your volunteers are, what kind of skills they can bring to the table. There's a lot of different forms out there that can really help a small campaign, especially if you have limited resources. I think one of the most important components is trying to scale, where are your volunteers and how much time do they have to give? I really, obviously I'm a little biased, but with the texting program, we were texting all day long, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. But if somebody couldn't text and maybe instead wanted to do something like data outreach, they could do that in the evenings. It was all about kind of having different levels of organizing. And, you might have somebody that isn't around all day because they work, but at night they have a few hours to give. It was, providing some of those vehicles and different varieties of ways to organize that really helped. Specific on the text team, you could shoot out 1,000 messages in 20 minutes during your lunch break. And I thought that was a really great way for people with maybe a little bit of limited time to help someone with maybe not a whole lot of time during the day can help translate in the evenings. So it's really about having those different, like a really clear pipeline and being able to have those working relationships with volunteers to ask, what is it that you can bring to the table and how can I better help you with the resources in order to scale that up? And so they feel like they have a part of this. They feel like they can have feedback and help build alongside of you.
Yeah, I have to agree 100% on really utilizing supporters who have time to invest, whether it's 10, 15 hours a week into your campaign and really hop in on this distributed model. I think it is what really changed up our organizing for the campaign, right? So, for example, I'll give you a very practical example, which was our Iowa caucus line, which again, we processed phone calls of people in Iowa calling in and asking about the different details about how to caucus for Bernie. People were asking a lot about where is my caucus location, or do I need to bring my ID? All sorts of questions, right? But the thing is, in Iowa, people were busy knocking on doors and doing door-to-door canvassing phone banking, the field organizers had a lot to do in one day, right? They do not have time to be answering phone calls from Iowans all throughout the day. And so that's when our help desk, our phone desk people were able to provide that support. And so we even had an Iowan staff member telling us, hey, can you please manage the Iowa at BernieSanders.com because we just do not have capacity right now. And so we did that for them. And then also having, again, the phone deskers who were online for, several hours a day answering phone calls. And now this person who does not even live in Iowa, they live in California, like in Pacific time, right? Who are dedicated and want to do something for Bernie, right? And want to use some of their skill to help get out the vote and inform voters. He's on the phone and answering phone calls. And now he's like an expert at the Iowa caucuses, right? He's able to just answer questions all day and really providing support for that team. And so I would say that the distributed model, and I see a lot of other campaigns doing this now, right, where people who don't even live in that state but want to help in some way, finding opportunities, whether it's for texting, like Vanessa was saying, or phone banking remotely, or providing support for help desk, really utilizing that energy and plugging them into distributed opportunities.
And going off what Michelle just shared, for the events team in particular, we had sort of two levels of volunteers. We had folks who were like campaign staff level volunteers, and these are the folks who helped us review events within 48 hours. And we saw thousands of volunteer-led events each week. And then we also had volunteer organizers, and this would be someone who would host a phone bank or host an organizing party or a more non-traditional event in their locale. And we made this possible by providing them with a host guide and script, which sort of provided the campaign strategy and messaging. I think one thing that's really important is if you're running a distributed program, be open and transparent and let your volunteers know what your plan to win is, because it just adds to the buy-in and the optimism. So they know the bigger picture at all times and the steps that they are contributing to get us to this bigger win. The other thing that I'll say is the flexibility, I think, which Vanessa and Michelle also highlighted. So the folks on the events team who moderated events could review events and mobilize basically at any hour of the day. And so I think that was really important. So differentiating and being really clear with the hours at which work and this volunteer work remotely could be done was really important. And then the other thing I'll say is the model helps for all progressive campaigns, in the sense that two volunteers that I worked with closely ended up supporting Jamal Bowman's campaign pretty heavily, which is pretty incredible. And so they can take these organizing lessons forward. And with distributed, you sort of unveil the workings behind a campaign, and it doesn't have to be a black box, which I think is really important. And then, of course, this sort of leadership development is transferable for any campaign, whether it's electoral or not. It's just how you build power.
Yeah, second, everything that was just said, I would add Google Sheets are your best friend and Google Formulas are your best friend, and automations that you can add on are really important, because when you're talking about distributed, what you're saying is no matter where someone is, they can plug into your work, they know how to do what they need to do, and they can do it at whatever hour of the day works for them, depending on what you're doing. You're not going to be calling people past midnight anywhere in the country, right? So it depends on the program you're building. We also integrated a distributed aspect to not just our call team that followed up with folks doing the relational organizing work, but we had Burn. So folks who are watching this, I'm sure everyone downloaded the Burn app. You could do relational organizing wherever you were. And I would say, if there are lower cost tools or free tools even out there that help facilitate these conversations with friends and family, the important thing is in viewing people with that organizing knowledge, utilizing things like Zoom and other webinar platforms to have broad onboarding conversations with folks, blasting that all over your socials, making sure that you're getting the broadest net of people possible to come in at the same time and go through that plan to win, go through how the team that you're building, the distributed team that you're putting together fits into that broader plan to win, go over whatever tech that you're going to be using and make space for people to actually demo it and ask questions, We were able to do this on a massive presidential campaign. We were able to do this with multiple types of technology, and investing that little bit of time that's extra and needed for folks who have a little bit of difficulty, and making sure that you're making yourself available for those one-on-one conversations. I had tons of one-on-one conversations, and fellow volunteers were trained to have those one-on-one conversations about the burnout. I'm sure Michelle saw a lot of questions about the burnout in the help desk as well. You just have to believe that people are capable of learning the technology that's necessary to do this work, and also make it as easy on yourself as possible to manage it on the back end. And I would say that this is probably the most robust example of why this movement is so powerful, right? We're all talking about, as Harinee just said, this is building power. This is harnessing that grassroots energy that we know exists in every corner of this country to really make those wins possible. There were folks calling from all over the country to make Charles Booker's win, or hopefully a win, but the race is possible yesterday in New York. So I don't want to get ahead of myself on these races, but the results are encouraging. And they absolutely were folks that were doing work with our campaign and learned how to use the dialer system because they did the Bernie call team, right? So I think it's imperative that we continue iterating, we continue having these discussions as a movement, and not assuming that everybody is capable of being an amazing organizer.
You all summed up distributed organizing so well, and you hit such important points. I think one of my favorite ones was something Harinee mentioned, in that being transparent and bringing folks into the scope of this work. Michelle and Vanessa also mentioned it, and Jess did too. Makes folks feel as though they're a part of something bigger, right? And I think that's the key to successful distributed organizing programs, as well as training volunteers, is making volunteers feel as though they're a part of the decision making and the efforts themselves. So we know that voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement are pervasive problems, mainly affecting BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color constituencies, who are oftentimes shut out of the American political process. This is purposely done to shrink the electorate and limit who has access to the ballot. And it's not just Republicans, but Democrats too. How did you and your organizing engage a wider range of voters, and how can the programs you worked with encourage more people to partake in participatory democracy?
I was going to say really quickly, and then I want to open it up to everybody else, that the key with relational organizing is that the messenger is the voter, right? So it's explicitly friend-to-friend organizing, I guess I'd like to call it, explicitly relies on people reaching out to folks in their network who can reach the low propensity voters, the folks who don't normally vote, the folks in our life who are apathetic, the folks who have moved a million different times, who we might not have their contact information, and disproportionately folks who are considered low propensity voters are folks who identify as BIPOC, who have irregular schedules and need to rely on folks like Michelle and her amazing voter protection team to call at any hour and figure out how to actually vote, what the system is. But through the network of your friends, when somebody reaches out to you and describes why this moment is so important to them in their own words, and they're somebody that is a family member or somebody that you trust in your life, you're going to take it more seriously, you're going to be more likely to act. And you're going to reach people that we never would have reached through traditional voter contact. So my little corner of the world, that was how we really tried to reach out to folks who have been traditionally left out of the process.
Yeah, totally. To second that, I mean, when we were going through this journey, we found that a lot of state voting websites just didn't translate or didn't have the means to be very clear and concise for somebody that's coming in that might speak a different language. Michelle was amazing in being able to provide those state guides, and then we would further translate those so that if somebody is coming in, we had a team of volunteer translators, and we were able to provide that information super clear and super concise. One of the examples I'm going to highlight is when we were doing Iowa caucus information, and we held trainings both in Nevada doing caucus trainings in Spanish, because this is a process that just isn't translated well, isn't communicated well within marginalized communities. And we had a woman that came to the Iowa caucus, only spoke Spanish. No one else spoke Spanish there, but because we were texting with her, we were able to connect her with someone on help desk to then walk her through the process in Spanish. And so it's all about providing these resources to these communities that are already translated, and you can do that by utilizing the volunteers that you have. The second thing I'm going to say is also just being very authentic and genuine. I think long gone are the days in which your candidate can just go on TV and say, vote for me in Spanish or in a different language, and everyone's like, yeah, that's good enough. We built out volunteer opportunities that were specifically in Spanish. So having forms that were in Spanish or just in another language helped people realize that they didn't, they could come in and have a seat at the table and have feedback. And talking about that also means being able to be authentic to whatever community you're talking to. So we didn't just assume that all Latinos wanted to talk about immigration and didn't just text them only because we thought that immigration was the only issue that they cared about. They also care about healthcare and education. And it was treating them as if they were, like any other citizen, and not just kind of having any broad assumptions that one single group of people all think or act the same. So yeah, I would say that, building out these resources, being incredibly genuine and authentic with these resources, and, doing your best to not only just translate your issues page, but making sure that that structure that you have for your English speaking teams are also translated in Spanish or in whatever language that you might find your small campaign in a different area might have other people of other ethnicities, and making sure that that's translated and available for them.
I will just pop in and talk a little bit about how critical the work that our volunteers did in engaging with people who might have never ever voted at all, but did for Bernie, right? And so we have just so many stories of phone desk of running our voter information hotline where people would call in and ask us, what is a primary, right? Just basic questions like that, which we just kind of assume that, greater public understands what a primary is. They have to, run against each other, the party, and then, take on Trump, right? And it really is humbling to see how voter information is just not in plain language most of the time, and how that in itself really marginalizes politically many communities, especially limited English proficient voters, voters of color, newly naturalized citizens, working class people who literally don't have the time on Tuesday to go vote or caucus for Bernie because they're working all day and all night, right? Or they have to take care of other folks in their household. And disenfranchisement particularly disproportionately affect this group of people, right? Marginalized already in our society. And so our team was able to engage with that one-on-one over the phone, and going through particular stories and scenarios on every call. And so, for example, we would talk to somebody who is a college student, is in another county and wants to vote for Bernie, or someone who recently moved. And people move all the time now, right? They move every 6 months or every year, and are now live in a state where you have to be registered Democrat by a certain deadline, right? And that again affects a specific group of people who are left out in the political process. And so that's how we engaged with this group of voters. And I think one of the things that I am really proud of on the campaign is the fact that we even provided a service. At the time, it was very stressful, and our teammates can probably attest to that, right? Like having to keep up with every single voting information and the things that were changing, during the pandemic, or even before that, things were changing all the time, and we were trying to understand the California primary process, all of that, right? It could be very stressful, but I think our team is just so proud that we were able to provide the service for our supporters, because I don't know any other candidate who provided a live hotline where anybody could call and ask and just be honest about how to vote and engage in this process.
I'll jump in to talk a little bit about events. So with events in particular, we sort of put it on volunteers, and they had the agency to organize the communities that they were a part of, organize in spaces that were frequented in their local areas. And so we didn't provide as much direction, but we did have an amazing constituency organizing program where we had folks lead Black people for Bernie, Unidos con Bernie, veterans for Bernie, Muslims and Arab Americans for Bernie, and of course, union members for Bernie, among other constituencies. So they, in many ways, used our host materials and guides that we provided and tailored for those specific constituencies. And this wasn't my particular team, but I do want to highlight one thing that I thought was beautiful was, already identifying where people are organizing. And so Nusayba had led canvassing outside masjids, outside mosque areas, areas where people would already congregate in general, which I think, that's organizing. You should totally get together where people are already naturally forming groups and have relationships, going back to Jess and relational organizing. So one thing that I've been reflecting a lot about is I think our events program could have maybe been a little bit more intentional in our recruitment and focus in terms of the new volunteers we were bringing in, how many new volunteers, and could have been more data driven in that way. And then of course, when you're not intentional with program design in general, you will design for white folks and typically middle and upper class white folks. So that's something that I'm thinking through still. And so I don't have very full and formulated thoughts around, but I do want to highlight the importance of intentionality in organizing trainings, in events, program guides, et cetera, that you put out. To really encourage other people to think and be class conscious, race conscious, gender, and other identities like front and center, but also trust that they know their communities best and they should organize where they have relationships.
Ooh, I love that. So much information and such valuable lessons that we can take moving forward when organizing constituencies that have been disenfranchised by our political system for a long time, right? And one of the most beautiful things we saw in the campaign were all of these first-time voters that came from various constituencies and supported a candidate like Bernie. And I believe that it's absolutely possible for all the other progressive candidates down the line. And so with that, thank you for sharing, everyone. We're going to talk about this last question now on the panel discussion. So just imagine if the campaign had continued and if COVID hadn't happened and you had all of the unlimited resources in the world to maximize your various programs, what would you have altered or changed or improved about it on the campaign? And really, what are some lessons you would pass on to anyone who wants to adopt relational organizing, virtual events, distributed events, help desk, or texting and translations?
I can go first since you listed me first. I forgot, by the way, to say it's been such a pleasure to be reunited with these folks because it was truly one of the most incredible experiences that I've had, that I think probably folks on this call have had, to really be able to innovate as much as possible in the progressive space around issues like Medicare for All, like a Green New Deal, like canceling student debt, and really turn people into organizers. And I think, man, if this were still going on today, I would absolutely be pushing the Burn app to be discussed in every live stream we would have. we pivoted to complete virtual work, right, as the pandemic hit, which was normal for all of us on this call, actually. Like, this is our normal habitat. And we really could lean into that, right? We had all these incredible systems where we could just plug people in to make calls, to send text messages. And I would have ramped up our webinars and try to bring as many folks into learning about the value of relational organizing, how to use the app, and really just intensify the level of investment in the broader campaign in this work, right? And I think for any relational program going forward, which I absolutely think every campaign on the left should use, not the right should not use relational organizing, that you have to have buy-in at the top. Folks have to understand, because it's a very different type of voter contact. It's a bit removed. The metrics have to be tracked through very specific means. And you have to have some faith in your volunteers that they're going to do this work. And you also have to be willing to follow up with them to do it. So invest early in this work. Really explain why to the folks who are decision makers, or if you are a decision maker, understand that this is really one of the most effective forms of outreach that we have at our disposal. And that's especially true in this moment when actually your friends and family are some of the people that we're looking to the most for information and to understand the world around them, more so than any particular campaign or issue. But two, also that this is a form of voter contact that should be central to your campaign, that it should be thoughtfully integrated. That, I wish that we would have had much more outreach into communities that might not have had awareness of the app, to do more just in-depth organizing work around relational mapping, how to think through who is even in your personal network, assess whether or not they're a Bernie supporter. Let's go over best practices for how we reach out to the folks in our life and persuade them that this is important. And this is how we actually get people to turn out to vote. So I would have absolutely just turned everyone into a relational organizer. And truly, I would have said that as much as we collaborated on the campaign, all of our work spoke to each other. And I would have been far more thoughtful in integrating the work that we all did going forward. And so I would say for any distributed program that campaigns want to build, think how these pieces are going to talk to each other, be intentional about how these pieces talk to each other, and do a lot of relational organizing. I'll add one thing. It's about the skill set and not necessarily about the technology. So really invest deeply in giving people those organizing skills and trust that they can learn the tech to do it well.
This question is amazing because it's a world that I want to live in right now. And I just would have loved to see how our campaign would have thrived under these conditions. Meaning, I really think that the way that our distributed teams were set up were kind of in like the perfect condition to be able to do and continue this remote organizing. We would have continued to provide very important information on how to vote safely and early during these conditions. We would have had, like just all this information. I think we would have been able to funnel it out to our amazing volunteers and then in turn let our supporters know on how they can support Bernie, how to do it safely, and just keep rallying around this platform, right? I would say that to be very specific about help desk costs, a lot of money in terms of running it because every volunteer has to have their own unique account in order to get into the inbox, in order to take a phone call, in order to talk to somebody on live chat, right? It costs money per username or per account. And so I love this question again because of the unlimited resources. Like, I love that. I wish we could just scale like crazy and have a bunch of people just on the inbox or on the phones, just being super, super hyper responsive to people calling in. Another thing that I would have loved to see, and maybe that's something that we could, see in the future, especially in a presidential, something large scale, is really building out a more sophisticated voter protection program, or having a pretty active legal counsel for each state, because that's something that specific states had, where if we had to escalate an issue on election day, where people called in reporting voter harassment or suppression, or and suppression can be all sorts of tactics, right? It could be administrative. It could be, some sort of error on an election administrator's end. It could also be very aggressive external factor that prevents someone to vote, right? And so having a way to escalate those issues quickly to a legal counsel would be, my dream come true. And yeah, I think that I really want to push having a help desk for really any campaign or organization, just because, again, it captures this group of people who want to get involved, but maybe fell in between the cracks or something, right? And help desk kind of bridges that gap so that nobody is left behind in moving forward and contributing, right? Whether it's hosting an event, someone doesn't know how, or, texting, they don't know how to get involved, right? It really bridges that gap, and you can really optimize, again, that energy of people wanting to be involved.
Yeah, the unlimited resources would have been great, especially to scale up and to hire up. I mean, shout out to Kim, Coley, Nat, Ed, Carlos, Kurt, everyone that was on our team, literally working around the clock to be able to run a texting program that texted every single 7 days a week from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. But I will say, other than that, having technology definitely, and having the resources to have good technology, something like Spoke, and having the resources to, have good data lists, and having the resources to have developers continue to work alongside of you as you're updating your programs, as you're trying to scale up. I mean, we would have easily just kept sending, like, as each day passed, we would surpass our last goal in terms of sending out texts. That all costs money. So I definitely think that there is a way for small campaigns to do this and do it in a smart way that, so long as you allocate those resources, it will pay off. And I say it will pay off because stats will show that 3 touch points on a person, and they're more likely to go out there and vote. So text messaging is one way and one variety of ways in order to reach out to a voter who maybe wouldn't pick up the phone, or maybe isn't on your email list, but now is engaged in having a texting conversation with you. So I would say the importance of text messages is just, to be able to kind of reach out like a window into someone's life, and seeing, we had really meaningful conversations about Medicare for All, about the hospital bill they couldn't pay, about the student debt that they're, currently struggling with. And we were able to have conversations about what Bernie's plan was for them. And obviously at the root of this all was just an amazing candidate. So it was easy for people to want to come to us, but making sure that they stay within our volunteer pipeline, making sure that they stayed invested in. We definitely would have scaled up in terms of the amounts of webinars we could have done. I would have really loved to see some organizations that we could have connected a little bit more with, especially as the pandemic took place. As soon as we saw this pandemic happening, we automatically had like Google Sheets for like, okay, we know that as we're texting people, they're going to respond with, I'm hurting right now. I don't have a job. I don't have food. Like, help me. And so we made sure that all of our volunteers were ready to know that these are the messages that we're going to get, and they can be really heavy, and B, having the resources to be able to answer to those questions. So things like, we had these Google spreadsheets that already had, if you are in this location in, if you're in New York and Brooklyn, here's where you can get food. Here's where you can get help. Here's how to apply for unemployment. And we were just really good at doing that. We utilized all of our resources. This came in from volunteers, and being able to then blast that information out to some of our constituents. I mean, we even had a webinar specific to the pandemic response in Puerto Rico. And that was just like a really amazing way in which the Bernie organization, we cared about every constituency that we had. So yeah, obviously higher up, but it doesn't mean that small campaigns can't have the same type of drive and passion. And I think that it just is speaking volumes, the power of organizing. We're seeing yesterday an amazing day in New York where some big money was against some of these progressive candidates, and the power of organizing, the power of being out in the streets, not just when, you want to win your election, but being out there and hosting webinars regularly and doing COVID call-in check-ins and stuff. It shows, and it's going to pay off. And I am just very hopeful for the future and very excited, because I think that the power of organizing is really going to it's going to win.
When it comes to events, the thing I'll leave us with is I think one, coordination would have been better. So to Jess's point, using relational and threading it through all of our events would have been really important. We could have done more trainings, especially so volunteers felt equipped to be organizers in their local areas. Even, I think with COVID, mutual aid networks and some sort of connection or facilitating connections in texting and otherwise. And then I do want to note that with unlimited resources, distributed isn't the end all be all. I think it's a really positive and powerful way to supplement. But in-person organizers are really key, and organizers who or people or supporters who would never be able to partake in distributed still need to be reached out to. And so for that, I think being able to better integrate and have more staff on the ground who are fully aware of the inner workings of our distributed program is also key. So they know, the clear lines of ways that distributed will help them organize on the ground, pandemic or otherwise.
Amazing, insightful, and so wise. Thank you for closing us up so well. We've gotten to the least favorite part of the live stream, which is the end. This has been such an insightful discussion and reflection about some of the organizing done behind the scenes on the Bernie 2020 National Organizing Team. And I, for one, am so grateful to have been able to organize alongside all these champions in organizing. So huge thank you to Harinee, Vanessa, Michelle, and Jess for sharing their experience with us, and also dropping some names of other team members who helped with this huge effort. Thank you for doing that and making time with us tonight. Remember, everyone, to follow them on social media and keep up with these leaders on their journeys, because there's a lot more in store. I'll pass it back over now to Lakshmi to close us out for this live stream. Lakshmi?
Thanks, Lynn, and to our special guest speakers and folks that I'm so grateful to call friends. I'm so honored to have fought alongside you, powerful, strategic organizers on this campaign. We know many folks felt very disheartened by the suspension of Bernie's campaign, but our collective work and purpose is interconnected and lives beyond just one campaign. Just this past week, we saw all of these programs lend a hand in the Movement for Black Lives 619's huge weekend of action. The changes that we hope to see will happen if we collectively work together to make it happen. We are a movement of many, and it's important for us to continue building power together by any means, from the bottom up with us and all the other organizations and candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Jamal Bowman and others determined to bring about Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, student debt cancellation, and an end to for-profit wars. Remember, again, to follow all of our speakers on their journeys by going to, once again, Twitter page, seeing our most recent posts. This has been one facet of the movement, and together we are truly building the future we believe in. The political revolution is real and happening right before our eyes. And although it's not happening as quickly as we'd like it to, it's nonetheless made possible thanks to you all. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Woo, thank you.